Tonight we begin not with a philosopher or a king, but with something far more dangerous and complicated: dating in the Middle Ages. Because believe it or not, finding love in a time of plagues, dowies and chaperones was somehow even more awkward than texting someone, "What you doing?" at 2 a.m. From courtly love songs to marriage by livestock negotiation, medieval romance was less about butterflies and more about land rights. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So, you're standing in a medieval village, or maybe a chilly stone castle wondering how to find love. Maybe strike up a conversation, compliment someone's hose, ask if they come here often. Nope, that's not how any of this works. If you're in the Middle Ages, dating in the modern sense doesn't really exist. You don't flirt, text, or go for long walks to see where it goes. Instead, your parents or your lord or your abbot are already deciding who you'll marry, when, and how many cows it will take to seal the deal. If you're a noble, you've probably been betrothed since before your voice dropped. You and your future spouse might meet for the first time on your wedding day. And yes, that's just as uncomfortable as it sounds. The whole thing is about land, titles, and family alliances, not compatibility, or how good they are at lute solos. If you're a peasant, things are slightly less formal, but only slightly. Your family still has a strong say, and love isn't really part of the discussion. Maybe your parents know a nice girl whose family owns a productive goat. Maybe they admire a boy who can thatch a roof without falling off. Boom, you're courting now. Lucky you. It's not that people in the Middle Ages don't feel romantic. They do. It's just not the priority. The goal is survival, inheritance, and social stability. Falling in love before marriage, that's risky. Falling in love outside of marriage, that's scandalous. Either way, it's frowned upon. Unless you're a character in a tragic poem, in which case go wild. And yet, you dream. Maybe you write a little verse on a scrap of parchment. Maybe you sneak a glance across the market. Maybe, just maybe, you fall for someone who wasn't pre-approved by your family's livestock appraiser. But for now, you wait. You obey. You try not to fall for the miller's apprentice. Because in this world, love might be the goal of poets, but marriage is the work of parents, priests, and politics. So, you think someone's cute. Maybe it's the way they balance a basket of onions on their head. Maybe it's the confident way they beat mud off a rug. Your medieval heart skips a beat. But steady yourself, because in this world, romance doesn't bloom without a balance sheet. Before you even think about courtship, you'd better ask, what do I bring to the table? And if your answer is a charming personality, you might want to sit down. If you're a young man, you'll need land or livestock or tools, or a roof that doesn't leak too much. Love letters are nice, but nothing says husband material like 2 healthy oxen and a roof that can survive a mild storm. If your father has already promised the best goat to your brother, well, you might want to consider the priesthood. If you're a young woman, your family needs a dowry. That could be coin, clothing, or a suspiciously generous number of geese. Doesn't matter how witty you are, if your family can't pay up, you're likely to spend a long time perfecting your embroidery alone. Now, let's say you actually like someone who makes your callous heart flutter. You lock eyes at the well. There's a spark. It's romantic, it's poetic, it's completely irrelevant. Because unless your families are on equal financial footing, you might as well fall in love with a cloud. If you're noble, it gets worse. Your hand in marriage is tied to land, borders, and political favours. You're not just a person, you're a walking treaty. Congratulations. Even peasants aren't safe. Marriage is practical. You don't marry for butterflies. You marry because your pig pen borders someone else's wheat field. You dream of passion. You settle for irrigation rights. And yet you try. Maybe you offer a small gift, a carved spoon, a handful of berries, or your finest, slightly cracked mug. Maybe they smile, maybe they don't, but the truth remains. In medieval dating, economics is the flirting and love is just a bonus you hope your spouse develops eventually. So, Let's say you're not a peasant worrying about pigs, or a noble dealing with treaties. Let's say you're a knight, shiny armor, big horse, questionable poetry skills. What's your love life like? Welcome to the strange and emotionally exhausting world of courtly love. Now, this isn't dating, this is performance art. Courtly love was a noble pastime, part flirting, part spiritual suffering, and entirely impractical. You, the brave knight, choose a noble lady, usually one who's already married, and vow to adore her from afar. Not physically, of course, that would ruin everything. No, you're supposed to suffer, elegantly. You might compose a few tortured verses about her silver laugh, or how her hair burns like the sun, which in medieval terms means she has hair and didn't insult your family. You wear her colours at tournaments. You pine, you sigh, you occasionally joust someone just because he glanced at her too long. The lady's role. She's supposed to pretend this is all very flattering, while maintaining a level of icy detachment that would terrify a glacier. She may respond with a letter, a token, maybe a ribbon, but mostly she'll just be mysterious and unattainable, which is the entire point. The emotions are high, the actual contact minimal. At best, you might get a nod from across the hall or a finger brushed against your gauntlet during a feast. Anything more, and suddenly it's not courtly love. It's a scandal, or worse, adultery. And no one wants that. At least not officially. This entire setup worked best when everyone involved agreed it was mostly pretend. It was a way to express longing, devotion, and creative angst, all without disrupting the social order. A medieval venting mechanism, if you will. Was it dramatic? Absolutely. Did it involve more poetry than practicality? Constantly. But for a knight stuck between battles and boredom, courtly love gave you something to write about and someone to write for. Just don't expect a happy ending, or a kiss, or even eye contact. So, you've fallen for someone. Great. Now comes the hard part, expressing that affection in a society where touching someone's hand without a chaperone is basically a declaration of war. Welcome to the medieval solution. Tokens. Think of it as 12th century texting, slow, confusing, and open to wildly inaccurate interpretation. Let's say you're a knight, and you're hopelessly in love with Lady Marjorie of whatever her last name is. You can't speak to her alone, and your poems keep getting intercepted by her confessor. What do? You send her a glove or maybe your embroidered sleeve. Nothing says I love you like mailing someone part of your wardrobe. And if you're on the receiving end, congratulations, you now have a sweaty linen sleeve you didn't ask for, and the romantic burden of pretending you know what it means. Is he confessing love, asking for a favour, suggesting a jewel? Who knows? Women gave tokens too, a ribbon, a piece of hair, a tiny pendant. It was sentimental, sure, but also deeply strategic. Give the wrong guy the wrong token and suddenly you're spoken for by someone with a lazy eye and a drinking problem. Tokens were meant to be subtle, a glove pinned to your chest, a ribbon tied to your sword hilt. Everyone knew what it meant, and no one said what it meant. The more cryptic the better. It was less about communication and more about plausible deniability. Oh, this glove. No, it's not from Lady Joan. It just appeared on my pillow, scented with lavender, completely random. For commoners, tokens were simpler. Maybe a wood carving, maybe a handkerchief you stitched when you weren't milking something. It was still romantic, just with more calluses involved. Tokens were also risky. Giving one to the wrong person could spark rumours. Receiving one you didn't want meant figuring out how to politely return someone's sock without insulting their lineage. But for all the awkwardness, these tokens carried real emotional weight. They were symbols of love in a world that didn't allow much room for it. You must say, "My soul is a stag pierced by the arrow of your grace, roaming the forests of yearning." Naturally, if you're literate, which, let's be honest, isn't a given, you pen your message on vellum or rough parchment. If you're really dedicated, you dust it with flower petals or perfume. Just be careful with that. One noble accidentally used a love letter to wrap a herring and delivered it to the wrong girl. They're married now, it's fine. Now comes the problem of delivery. You can't just hand it over. You need a courier, a loyal servant, a bribed monk, or a younger sibling with limited understanding of consequences. Sometimes, Even a minstrel would do the job, singing your poem in the town square while pretending it was anonymous. Subtle, and the poetry risky, very risky. The line between romantic and heresy was thinner than a monk's patience during Lent. If your metaphor even hinted at anything physical, you might find yourself confessing to both lust and literary exaggeration. But, despite all the rules, people did write. Some letters survived, some poems were copied and passed around like forbidden fruit. In a world of rigid roles and constant supervision, a folded scrap of words could feel revolutionary. So you write. You risk it, you press your trembling hand to the parchment and say everything you can't say aloud. Just don't sign it too clearly. You want romance, not a church trial. Finally a break, a feast day, a harvest festival, a maple dance. In short, a rare moment when your life isn't just work, prayer, and pretending you're not interested in the blacksmith's daughter. Today you're allowed to flirt, sort of as long as no one sees, or everyone sees, but pretends not to. Welcome to medieval festivals, where romance blooms under the watchful eyes of everyone you've ever met, and 3 chickens. Festivals were one of the few socially approved moments when men and women could mingle, laugh, and dare we say, make eye contact. There's music, there's ale, there's someone wearing a flower crown with dangerous confidence. You've never seen so many people not pretending to be miserable. If you're a peasant, you might try to impress your crush by winning the sack race, catching a greased pig or juggling 3 stale rolls of bread. Nothing says, I'm available like falling off a hay bale with dignity. Dancing was your best shot at actual physical contact. The rules were rigid, but a well-timed spin or a not-quite-accidental hand graze could say more than any poem. The maple dance, for example, was basically a giant excuse for coordinated flirtation wrapped in ribbons and plausible deniability. And if you're noble, your version of flirting at a festival involved less hay and more poetry. You might compose a verse on the spot, compare your lady's eyes to twin candles or other glowing things, and offer a trinket. Hopefully not one that was clearly made by your servant 5 minutes earlier. Food helped too. Offer your beloved a meat pie or share a honey cake. If they accept it with a smile, you're doing well. If they hand it to their dog, start over with someone else. But remember, everything you do, someone is watching. A parent, a priest, a bard with a big mouth, one misstep, and your flirty smile becomes a youthful indiscretion discussed at church for the next 6 weeks. Still, for a few hours you can pretend. Pretend you're in a world where love isn't a transaction, where laughter isn't suspicious, and where dancing in public doesn't end in penance. Let's say you're not a knight, a noble, or a bard with a lute and excessive feelings. You're a regular villager. You wake up with the cows, go to bed with the chickens, and spend most of your day ankle-deep in mud. You're not looking for a poetic soulmate. You're looking for someone who can milk a goat without emotional drama. Welcome to peasant courtship, where romance is practical, gestures are modest, and chemistry means we can survive winter together. In your world, dating is less about long conversations and more about shared tasks. You notice someone you like because they work hard, don't complain much, and have a decent set of teeth. That's it. That's the whole checklist. You're not picky, you're realistic. You don't need fireworks. You need someone who can gut a fish and maybe doesn't snore too loudly. So how do you show interest? You give gifts, small, useful things. A basket of eggs, a bundle of firewood, a good turnip. And if you're feeling bold, maybe a woven ribbon or a carved spoon. Nothing says I'm serious about you like a spoon you whittled by candlelight while your pig judged you silently. Conversations happen during shared chores. You might walk together to the mill, chat while tending sheep, or exchange pleasantries while shoveling something that smells questionable. No one's reciting poetry. You're talking about the weather, crop yields, and whether or not old Thomas fell in the well again. And yet, in its own way, it's romantic. There's a sweetness in the simplicity, a shared life built not on idealism, but on cooperation. You know each other's strengths, weaknesses, and how fast they run when a goat escapes. Proposals often came quickly. If you both agreed and the families did too. Marriage followed. Maybe you moved into a shared hut. Maybe you built a new one from scratch with help from the village. You brought your best blanket. They brought a goat. Together, you began the strange miracle of domestic survival. It's not glamorous, but it's honest. You've done it. You've found someone who can cook, clean, tolerate your family, and doesn't visibly recoil at the sight of your feet. True love, right? Now, it's time to get married. which in medieval terms means you're entering into a contract, not a dreamy vow under the stars, a legally binding transaction, often negotiated with all the passion of a livestock auction. If you're a peasant, it's still a big deal. You gather a few witnesses, talk to the local priest, and try not to trip over the Latin during the ceremony. But behind the sweet-sounding blessings is a serious checklist: Dewey, land rights, who gets the cow, and what happens if someone dies during planting season. Ah, yes, romance. If you're from the upper class, buckle up. Your marriage is a full-blown legal negotiation. Your parents, their parents, the priest, the scribe, maybe a cousin who once studied law, they're all in on it. The bride and groom, mostly just standing nearby, looking decorative and nodding when spoken to. You may or may not have even met the person you're marrying. Your family has done the math. Your estate needs her fields. Her Dewey balances your debts, and both of your coats of arms look good next to each other. Love is optional. The merger is not. And once you're married, it's permanent. Divorce isn't really a thing unless you can prove someone wasn't baptised, was secretly related to you, or died and forgot to mention it. Annulments existed, but they required a lot of paperwork, a bit of luck and a solid bribe. Still, not everything is bleak. Some couples genuinely grew to love each other. Shared chores, raising children, surviving winters. These things have a way of building affection, or at least tolerance, which in medieval terms is basically the same thing. The church was involved in every step. Marriage was a holy sacrament, one of the 7 big ones. You didn't just marry for legal reasons, you married because God needed a witness, possibly 2. So you stand, exchange vows and smile as someone hands over a sack of onions and calls it a blessing. So let's say you've had enough. Enough contracts, enough negotiations, enough being treated like a particularly valuable sack of flour. You're a noble, but for once you want to marry for love, not for land, not for lineage, not for your father's strategic ambitions, just love. Congratulations, you're about to cause a scandal. Noble elopements were the medieval equivalent of lighting your family tree on fire and dancing in the ashes. If you ran off to marry someone of your own choosing, it wasn't just personal rebellion, it was political sabotage. Let's say your Lady Ella Lenana promised a Subring von estate secure, but you've fallen madly in love with a penniless squire who smells faintly of horses and adventure. You meet in secret, whisper sweet nothings in the stables, and one day you vanish off to a monastery where the abbot owes you a favour. There you marry under questionable legality, with only a nervous monk and 2 chickens as witnesses. Back at home, chaos. Your family outraged. Your father threatening to siege the groom's family garden. Your mother crying into her embroidery hoop. The church deeply concerned, the gossip delicious. And if you're the groom in this romantic rebellion, don't get too comfortable. Best case scenario, you get to keep your bride and your kneecaps. Worst case, you're excommunicated and disemboweled in that order. Still, some couples got away with it. If the union couldn't be undone without causing even more embarrassment, families sometimes just sighed and moved on. After all, what's done is done, and at least nobody died. Hopefully. In rare cases, these scandals became legends. Songs were written, poems composed, stories whispered at banquets. 2 nobles who chose love over duty, practically mythological. And yes, most noble marriages were transactional. But these moments, brief rebellions, passionate escapes, whispered vows beneath moonlit towers, they reminded the world that love, though inconvenient, refused to go extinct. So, if you ever feel dramatic for swiping left or turning down a second date, just remember at least your love life doesn't involve secret weddings, angry barons, and a horse tied to a ladder outside your window. Ah, marriage. That beautiful union of 2 souls and their respective financial portfolios. Because in the Middle Ages, love was nice, but a dowie, now that was truly romantic. Let's say you're a bride. You're not just getting married, you're being launched like a small dowie-equipped economic vessel. Your family prepares your dowie: money, livestock, land, linens, a cow or 2, depending on how lovable they think you are, and maybe even a set of pewter dishes if they're feeling generous. These offerings go to your future husband, who accepts you and your portable wealth with open arms and a mental calculator. Now, flip the scenario. In some cultures or regions, it's not the bride's family giving the goods. It's the bride price. The groom pays her family for the honour of marrying her, effectively saying, here's a horse, a cloak and 3 pigs. Now give me your daughter. Medieval romance at its finest. The point is, someone is paying someone. You're getting married, and there is absolutely a receipt involved. These exchanges weren't just about wealth, they were about status, expectations and public statements. A large diary might indicate a bride came from a prestigious family. A stingy one might suggest they were trying to offload her quickly. possibly due to suspicious personality traits or a habit of talking back. You, as the bride, didn't usually get to keep your doughy. It became part of the household economy, managed by your husband, guarded by the law, and hopefully not gambled away on dice and ale within the first month of marriage. If the marriage ended through death, annulment, or your husband wandering off to join a monastery after midlife regret, your doughy could theoretically be returned. But retrieving it was often harder than pulling a sword from a stone. You'd need support, legal backing, and ideally someone who could read. Meanwhile, the bride price, if paid, was like buying a rare goat. Expensive up front and no refunds. It compensated the bride's family for the loss of her labour. After all, who's going to milk the sheep now? So, while love was occasionally in the mix, money was always at the altar. So you didn't go the marriage route. Maybe you were the second son, or your doughy was suspiciously small, or you just really liked chanting. Either way, you've joined a monastery or convent. Congratulations, you've now taken a vow of poverty, chastity, and an aggressive disinterest in romance. And yet here you are, in a stone cloister surrounded by silence, candle smoke, and Brother Anselm's unexpectedly soulful eyes. Yes, even behind monastery walls, forbidden love found a way. To be clear, falling in love in a religious order was deeply discouraged, like you might get whipped, exiled, or lectured by someone with a Latin name discouraged. You've sworn to give your heart entirely to God, which means giving it to literally no one else. But hearts are unruly, and sometimes prayers start sounding a lot like love poems. Maybe it starts with innocent tasks, passing each other bread in the refectory, whispering during vespers, laughing a little too hard when someone drops a hymnal. Before you know it, you're tucking extra cheese into Sister Beatrix's satchel and questioning everything. Some monks and nuns wrote passionate letters, disguised, of course, as theological musings. Your soul is a shining light in the darkness of my contemplation. Sounds holy, unless you read between the lines. And many did. There were inevitably scandals, secret meetings in the herb garden, midnight confessions that weren't strictly sacramental, and the occasional gasp-worthy discovery of a nun with a suspiciously round belly. The punishment, usually harsh, exile, public penance, or being reassigned to some far-off abbey known mostly for sheep and silence. Still, not all stories ended in disgrace. Some lovers escaped. A few even got married after being defrocked. Most, though, returned to their clusters, red-faced and pre-devoted, swearing that the whole thing was just an overzealous theological debate. Because in the end, monastic life was about discipline. But humans are humans, even in robes, even in silence. And sometimes, a quiet glance across the chapel was more thrilling than any tournament or courtly poem. You did it. You got married. There was a priest, a pig roast, and someone spilled me on your mother's only nice cloak. But now, it's been a few months or years, and something feels off. Maybe your spouse snores like a dying lute. Maybe they forgot to mention their chronic gambling problem. Or maybe you just realised that marrying for land and sheep doesn't automatically result in romantic bliss. Either way, welcome to the world of medieval marital disappointment. Now, don't go reaching for the divorce papers, because they don't exist. At least, not in any form you'd recognise. Marriage was a sacred and unbreakable bond approved by the Church, sealed by God, and enforced by public shame. You could try for an annulment, but you'd need a very good reason. We don't get along doesn't cut it. You'd have to prove that one of you was underage, already married, too closely related, which happened disturbingly often. Or, best case scenario, never consummated the marriage, which meant someone had to confirm that fact in writing, possibly under oath. Good luck. If you're a noble, it gets messier. Your marriage wasn't just personal, it was political. Trying to escape it could start a feud, ignite a scandal, or launch a minor war. Best to just quietly resent each other and attend separate feasts. So, what do unhappy couples do? Mostly, they just endure. You sleep in different beds. You sigh dramatically at dinner. You pour your feelings into embroidery or that one really angry psalm. Passive aggression becomes your love language. Of course, the church condemned it, but that didn't stop people. It just made them better at sneaking around barns and blaming things on God's mysterious will. For women, getting out of a bad marriage was especially hard. Even if your husband was violent or vanished, society expected you to stay loyal, silent, and mildly pious, while surviving off bread crusts and disapproval. Still, some people made it work. Marriages weren't always happy, but they could become partnerships forged by hardship, habit, and the shared experience of hauling firewood in the rain. Let's say your spouse dies. Maybe it was the plague, maybe a farm accident, maybe they tripped over a goose in the dark. However it happened, you're now widowed, and suddenly the medieval dating pool opens back up. Being a widow in the Middle Ages was oddly liberating. Not do whatever you want liberating, but certainly more freedom than you had before. For women especially, widowhood often brought a taste of independence, managing land, making decisions, even speaking in public without being immediately shushed. And if you were youngish and still had teeth, you could remarry quickly, very quickly. Mourning periods existed, but so did survival instincts. A widow with land and no husband was basically a walking treasure chest. Suitors appeared with alarming speed, some sincere, others just very enthusiastic about your dairy cows. If you're a man and recently widowed, society practically pushes you back into marriage. Who else is going to cook, clean, and raise the 11 children you somehow accumulated? So you start looking. Maybe the baker's daughter. Maybe that quiet widow who always brings suspiciously good me to market. Romance and second marriages could be surprisingly sweet. This time around, you're older, wiser. You're not being pushed into an alliance, you're choosing someone to survive with. Maybe even someone you like. Wild concept. Of course, there were rules. The church frowned on remarriage that happened too quickly. Like your spouse isn't cold, yet quickly, and widows often had to negotiate with family over dowies and inheritance. Nothing says romantic second chance like arguing with your brother-in-law over who keeps the butter churn. But still, second marriages were common, even expected. Life was short, winters were long. No one wanted to spend them alone if they didn't have to. And yes, love was part of it. Maybe not the swooning sonnet-writing kind, but the quiet kind, based on shared stories, mutual respect, and the understanding that both of you had already seen some things. So you light the fire, pour the soup, and try again. Not because it's perfect, but because it's human. You've made it this far, survived the contracts, the courtships, the chaperones, and possibly a dramatic barn elopement. But before you fall for someone new, ask yourself the most medieval question of all. Are you cosmically allowed to love this person? Because in the Middle Ages, love wasn't just a matter of the heart, it was a matter of stars, bones, and whether or not your grandmother saw a fox this morning. Let's begin with astrology. Yes, before you kissed anyone, you might want to consult the local monk astrologer. Are your signs compatible? Is Venus in retrograde? Was your beloved born under an unlucky moon? If so, better to marry someone less cursed. Love is hard enough without planetary sabotage. Then there were birthmarks, mysterious little symbols that might identify you as your soulmate's long-lost twin, or their destined executioner. Superstitions were flexible like that, but the church had its own checklist. You couldn't marry your cousin, or your second cousin, or your fourth cousin twice removed, unless you had special permission, which the wealthy often bought because loopholes. So before things got serious, you probably need to draw a family tree, and then quietly erase parts of it. Social status also mattered deeply. A noble could not fall in love with a peasant without it being declared either a miracle or a moral failing. Cross-class romance was rare, scandalous, and only acceptable if it later became a tragic folk song. And then there were the omens. If a raven flew overhead while you were thinking about someone, bad sign. If you drop bread at dinner while glancing at your crush, forget it. That's a cursed union. Someone might bury a charm under your doorstep to protect you from improper suitors or to sabotage your chances. Either worked. Love in this world wasn't just personal, it was mystical. Everyone had an opinion, the stars, the saints, the weather, and that one woman in the woods who definitely wasn't a witch, except she probably was. But despite all the rules, signs, and whispered warnings, people still loved clumsily, bravely, often against advice. Because medieval or not, the heart remains wonderfully disobedient. You've probably heard of Alexander the Great, maybe even Julius Caesar, but have you ever heard of the woman who allegedly chopped off the head of Cyrus the Great and dunked it in blood? Her name was Tomaris, and she didn't rule from a throne gilded in gold or within high-walled cities. No, her court was the open sky, her army was the wind, and her power came not from titles, but from pure, unshakable authority. She was queen of the Massagetæ, a confederation of nomadic tribes who roamed the steppes of Central Asia. Think horse archers, tattooed warriors, ritual feasts, and battlefield justice. Tomaris didn't inherit her power from a pampered courtier system. She rose through grit, leadership, and possibly a healthy dose of don't mess with me energy. Her people were tough, accustomed to harsh winters, long migrations, and enemies on every side. But even among such people she stood out. She was a warrior, a lawgiver, and a ruler in her own right. No husband overshadowed her, no brother guided her hand. Now, to be clear, much of what we know about Tomaris comes from the Greek historian Herodotus, a man not exactly known for his strict fact-checking. But if even a fraction of his account is true, then Tomaris wasn't just a queen, she was a storm in human form. At the heart of her story is this: a foreign superpower was growing stronger by the day, the Achaemenid Persian Empire, led by Cyrus the Great. He had already conquered Lydia and Babylon, and now his gaze turned east. The Massagetæ were next on his list. But Cyrus didn't fully understand what kind of woman he was dealing with. Before the first arrow flew, before the first spear shattered, and before her son's death changed everything, Tomaris was already preparing for war. Not because she wanted conquest, but because she refused submission. She wasn't just defending territory, she was defending a way of life. And as Cyrus would soon learn, there are some queens you just don't invade. Cyrus the Great had a reputation. He wasn't just any king, he was a conqueror's conqueror, the kind of man who could stroll into ancient cities, topple empires, and still be remembered fondly by historians. So when Cyrus the Great looked east toward the land of the Massagetæ, he didn't expect resistance. After all, who could say no to the man who had taken Babylon without breaking a sweat? He sent a polite offer first, a political marriage to Queen Tomaris. It might have sounded romantic, but Tomaris saw through it. This wasn't about love or alliance, it was about control. If she accepted, her kingdom would become a Persian province, and she a decorative trophy. She declined. Cyrus, not used to hearing no, didn't take it well. If charm failed, conquest would follow. He crossed the Araxes River and built a foothold in Massagetæ territory. But Tomaris wasn't idle. She gathered her warriors, consulted her chiefs, and prepared for what she knew was inevitable: war. Then came the trap. Under advice from his general Harpagus, Cyrus left behind a luxurious camp filled with food and wine, items rarely available to nomads. Tomaris's son, Spargapaises, led a detachment to investigate. They raided the camp and indulged, unaware it was bait. The Persians returned at just the right moment. Spargapaises and his men, drunk and unprepared, were overwhelmed. He was captured alive. When Tomaris learned what had happened, her world cracked. This wasn't just a military loss, it was personal. Her son, her heir, was now in Persian hands. She sent a message: "Give him back and leave, or I will give you your fill of blood." Cyrus didn't listen. Spargapaises, ashamed of his capture, took his own life. Tomaris had just lost her only son. Grief alone is powerful, but grief mixed with fury, that's devastation. She didn't retreat into mourning. She mounted her horse, sharpened her weapons, and swore an oath of vengeance. According to Herodotus, she summoned her council and rallied the Massagetæ. Picture hundreds of mounted warriors in leather armour, their faces painted, weapons gleaming, riding like a storm across the steppe. When they clashed with Cyrus's forces, it wasn't a battle, it was an eruption. Tomaris led the charge herself, not as a queen in silk, but a warrior in blood and dust. The Persians, caught in the storm of her fury, fell. Cyrus the Great, conqueror of kings, was dead. Tomaris found his body, ordered his head severed, and plunged it into a wineskin full of blood. "You thirsted for blood," she said. "Drink your fill." It was vengeance, it was legend, and it was a warning. Some queens you do not cross. They didn't march like a Persian army. They moved like a storm, swift, chaotic, and precise. This time, the trap was hers. Cyrus, perhaps emboldened by his earlier success, underestimated Tamiris's fury. But she had studied his tactics. She waited, watched, and then unleashed her warriors at the perfect moment. The two armies clashed in what Herodotus describes as one of the bloodiest battles of the ancient world. There were no elegant formations, no noble speeches, just thundering hooves, clashing steel, and a queen in the heart of the fight. No silk-robed empress. Tamiris fought like one of her own, blade in hand, riding hard through the chaos, cutting down enemies with ruthless focus. And when the dust cleared, Cyrus the Great was dead. Ever theatrical in her justice, Tamiris had his body searched. His head was cut off, dropped into a wineskin full of blood, and presented as a final message. According to Herodotus, she spoke directly to it. You thirsted for blood, now drink your fill. Whether or not every detail is true matters less than what it represented. Tamiris had won. She crushed the greatest empire of her time, avenged her son, and secured a legacy as a queen no one could ignore. This wasn't just a battlefield victory. It was a shift in the fate of empires. The battlefield fell silent. Persian soldiers were dead or fleeing. Their legendary king lay lifeless in the dirt, and Tamiris didn't raise her arms in triumph. She didn't ride through captured cities or mint coins in her name. She stood over Cyrus's body, her vengeance complete, her heart still broken. Victory didn't bring her peace. The Massageti had done more than win a battle. They had halted an empire. The death of Cyrus sent tremors across the known world. In Babylon, Egypt, and across the Persian realm, whispers travelled. The unstoppable king had fallen, not to another empire, but to a nomadic queen, with no palace, no crown, just fury and a cavalry that would ride into fire for her. And yet, Tamiris didn't seize more land. She didn't tax her people, didn't march on Persepolis, didn't demand a throne. Her justice was done. Her son was avenged. The empire could go on, but it would remember her. It would hesitate before ever moving east again. What's even more striking is what she didn't do. Most rulers, after defeating a superpower, would grasp for more land, more power, more legacy. But Tamiris cared more about preserving her people's freedom than ruling others. And then, she vanishes. There are no more records, no tomb, no statue, no temple bearing her name. She rides into the fog of history, untamed, unclaimed, like the steppes she called home. Some say Herodotus exaggerated. Others say he didn't go far enough. Some say Cyrus died elsewhere, that the wineskin of blood was poetic fiction. But even skeptics agree. Someone dealt Persia a devastating blow, and it wasn't a king, it wasn't a general. It was a queen, a mother, whose love for her son became one of the most dramatic reckonings in ancient history. Her story didn't need to be carved in stone. It travelled by wind, because when the wind howls across the steppe, some say it still whispers her name. To understand Tamiris, you have to understand her people. The Massageti weren't like other ancient civilizations. No temples of marble, no hanging gardens, no scrolls of epic poetry. They were a nomadic warrior culture, shaped by the wild, open lands east of the Caspian Sea, lands too untamed for Persian governors or Babylonian scribes. Their world was movement, survival, and honour. Picture endless plains with no borders, where wealth was counted in horses and cattle, and children learned to ride before they could walk steady. Archery was second nature, not sport. Their bows were compact and deadly, their armour made of layered leather and scale, light enough to ride, tough enough for war. They hunted, they raided, and they fought for freedom. Unlike many patriarchal societies of the time, Massageti women fought too. It wasn't rare, it was expected. Warrior women weren't stories, they were sisters, neighbours, leaders. So when Tamiris picked up a blade and led her people into battle, no one was shocked. She wasn't defying roles, she was fulfilling them, only better, sharper, and more dangerous than most. Their society prized strength but also justice. Crimes were punished swiftly but fairly. Property was often communal. What mattered most was loyalty to the tribe and the ability to defend it. Kings and queens led by merit, not bloodline. Leadership was earned, and in faith they worshipped the sun. When Tomyris warned Cyrus, she swore by the sun, the master of the Massagetes. The sun stood for life, truth, and cosmic justice. To break your word was to defy the heavens themselves. In this world, Tomyris wasn't an anomaly. She was the ideal, fierce, fair, and proud. She rose not despite being a woman, but because she embodied exactly what her people revered. While the Persians built empires through bureaucracy, the Massagetes lived with freedom as their backbone, and in one brutal, history-shaking battle, that freedom proved stronger than empire. When you come from a land where the wind never rests, and the sky is your only roof, submission is not an option. And here's the strange part. Everything we know about Tomyris, from her war to the wineskin of blood, comes from one man, Herodotus. He's called the father of history, but also the father of hearsay, myth, and dramatic flair. The man loved a good story. And if that story had divine omens, brutal revenge, or a queen shoving a severed head into a bag of blood, so much the better. So, how much of Tomyris's tale is true? That depends on how much you trust a Greek historian writing decades after the fact, who likely never met a single Massagetai in his life. Herodotus worked with second-hand stories, traveller gossip, and imperial rumour. To him, history wasn't a ledger, it was theatre. Still, here's the thing. He chose to tell her story. In a world dominated by male warlords and kings, he stopped to highlight a steppe queen who took down one of history's most powerful rulers. That says something. And the tale spread fast, for good reason. It had everything. A noble queen, a beloved son, betrayal, war, and a finale fit for Greek tragedy. If you were an Athenian listening to a travelling bard, you'd remember Tomyris forever. Not because she wore a crown, but because she stood against a superpower, and won. Over centuries, her story transformed. Medieval writers imagined her as a savage Amazon. Renaissance artists painted her soaked in blood, holding Cyrus's head like a grim trophy. She became exotic, terrifying, unforgettable. Yet, through every retelling, something real remained. Maybe not the wineskin of blood, maybe not the exact words, but the bones of it. The mother, the son, the war, the vengeance, feel too vivid to be pure invention. Herodotus didn't just record her, he elevated her into myth, and that myth has outlived kings, generals, and empires. Because history forgets commanders, but it remembers vengeance. Tomyris, who left no monuments, no inscriptions, no tomb, has haunted the imagination of the world for over 2,000 years. In 1622, Peter Paul Rubens painted her, holding Cyrus's severed head calmly as courtiers looked on in awe. In another, she stands statuesque as the head is ceremonially dipped into a gold basin overflowing with blood. Tasteless? Maybe. Unforgettable? Definitely. To European artists, she wasn't just historical, she was symbolic. To some, she was righteous fury. To others, a barbarian queen, a cautionary tale, a feminist icon, a warning. Writers loved her too. In the 18th and 19th centuries, she appeared in novels, plays, and political philosophy. Enlightenment thinkers argued over her legacy. Was she proof women could rule wisely, or an example of passion overtaking reason? Either way, her name stayed in print, and yet her own people vanished from the record. The Massagetai were absorbed by later nomads. They left no writings, no monuments, no tomb marked Tomyris was here. Her memory survives entirely through the eyes of outsiders. And still she returns. In Soviet-era Central Asia, she was resurrected as a national symbol of resistance to empire. Proof that no matter who writes the history, some names refuse to disappear. No statues? No problem. Her name still rides on the wind of the steppe. Her story still humbles emperors, and her legend still whispers a warning. Come for me, and you'll drink your fill of blood. So the next time you hear of a great king's fall, remember, sometimes the final blow doesn't come from an empire, but from a queen on horseback, lost to history but never truly gone. Imagine a life where your walls are made of felt, your roof stitched from hide, and your door opens to endless horizon. No cities, no farmland, no stone temples to pass on, just hoofbeats, the murmur of tall grass and a sky in constant motion. For ancient nomads, permanence was an illusion, mobility was power. From the Eurasian steppes to the deserts of Arabia, these cultures shaped history without marble monuments. They weren't ruthless wanderers. They were adaptive strategists, guided by season, terrain, and herd migration. Homes were yurts or wagons, collapsible strongholds for moving life. Horses weren't just tools, they were wealth, weapons, and sacred kin. A person's status wasn't land, it was livestock. To ride well was survival. To ride best was to rule. But mobility didn't mean chaos. Nomadic societies were often complex, their politics rooted in clan and kin, with leaders rising through merit, influence, and battlefield respect, not birthright. A Khan could rise from the campfire through cunning and courage. Loyalty was earned, not inherited. And these nomads weren't cut off from the world, they connected it. Silk from China, spices from India, silver from Persia, and slaves from Europe moved through their hands. They were the original transcontinental couriers, centuries before empires built roads. And when diplomacy failed, they raided, swift, precise, and utterly devastating. Their history wasn't carved into stone, it was sung, remembered, and passed down. Laws and legends lived in memory, carried by bards and elders. A single voice could preserve a tribe's justice, past, and identity. Stories weren't distractions, they were survival manuals, blueprints for society. To the empires, nomads were wild and dangerous, but to themselves they were free, cunning, proud, heirs of the wind. They left few ruins, but changed the world every time they rode. And before the Mongols thundered across Eurasia, there were the Scythians, rulers of the wild plain. From the 9th to 2nd centuries BCE, these mounted warriors dominated from the Black Sea to Central Asia. To the Greeks, they were terrifying barbarians. To themselves, they were freedom on horseback. Their society revolved around riding and raiding. Their weapons were deadly and practical, short composite bows perfect for firing mid-gallop, curved swords, iron-tipped spears. And these warriors? Not just men. Archaeological evidence confirms what Herodotus hinted long ago. Women fought too. Burial sites reveal female skeletons laid to rest with weapons, bearing real combat wounds. The Scythians didn't build cities, but their burial mounds, called kurgans, preserved their memory. Beneath them, archaeologists have uncovered gold, tattooed skin, embroidered garments and weapons. Their art, filled with swirling animals and predatory symbols, reflected a life bound to nature and blood. But they weren't just raiders. They were traders, diplomats and mercenaries. Along the Black Sea, they sold grain, furs and slaves to Greek colonies, and in return imported pottery, wine and luxury items. Greek writers were both horrified and fascinated. Herodotus described them drinking enemy blood and using scalps as napkins, but also praised their justice and loyalty. Their religion was animistic and wild, fire gods, war spirits, and rituals involving horse sacrifice or cannabis smoke. Their worldview was cyclical, not based on owning land, but moving with it. In time they faded. Squeezed by rival tribes like the Sarmatians and encroaching empires, they vanished into history. But they set the image of the steppe warrior, mobile, deadly and untamed. They wrote no books, but their silhouette, a lone archer on horseback, still haunts the plains. They were the storm before empire. While they ruled the grasslands, the Bedouin carved their legacy into sand. In the deserts of Arabia, they became masters of survival. Their homes were black goat hair tents, portable, breathable, and adapted for motion. Their lives moved with camels, transport, food, wealth, and pride. Bedouin society centered on clan and honor. Loyalty to kin was law. Sharaf, honor, was everything. A single insult could start a feud, but karam, hospitality, was sacred. A guest received food and protection for 3 days, no questions asked. Their warfare focused on raids, gazwu, swift strategic attacks to capture livestock or goods. Raids were about skill and reputation, not slaughter. Poetry was their library. Poets preserved laws, shamed rivals, and praised heroes around campfires in oral verse. Some poems became legend, others became lore. Bedouins were also traders and guides. They moved incense, spices, and silk across the peninsula, connecting cultures long before borders existed. They left few ruins but shaped the rhythms of trade and survival. In the eyes of empires, they were unpredictable, but to themselves, they were guardians of freedom, moving, adapting, remembering, etched not in stone, but in sand and story. They knew every oasis, every star path. Bedouin knowledge was legendary and expensive. Though many later joined cities and empires, they held tightly to their identity. Even today, the black tent and tribal codes remain symbols of Bedouin pride. They weren't just desert survivors, they were its soul. But no nomadic people reshaped the world like the Mongols. In the 13th century, they burst from the Mongolian steppe and built the largest continuous land empire in history. Yet their roots mirrored those before them, mobile, clan-based, and ruthlessly adaptive. Life on the steppe was harsh. Mongols lived in gurs, felt tents they could pack in an hour. Their herds sustained them, and their children were raised in the saddle. Riding came before reading. Most Mongols were illiterate, but didn't need books. Their world was stored in songs, sayings, and stories. What made them different was how they weaponized mobility. Genghis Khan shattered tribal divisions, replacing them with loyalty to him. That loyalty changed history. Mongol warfare was pure velocity, horse archers firing at full gallop, faking retreats, covering over 100 miles a day. They used scouts, flags, decoys, and fear as tools of war. But they weren't just raiders, they adapted fast. Once they encountered cities, they learned siege warfare from Chinese and Persian engineers. Catapults, fire arrows, battering rams, used with terrifying success. And then the twist, they weren't just destroyers, they became the great connectors. The Mongol Empire revived and protected the Silk Road, enabling safe travel from China to Europe. Goods, ideas, and even plagues moved through their hands. They used paper currency, issued passports, and promoted religious tolerance. A monk, a merchant, and a mystic could all travel under Mongol rule, so long as they didn't rebel. Yet even as rulers, they stayed nomads. They governed in tents, returned to their herds, lived with the wind. They conquered cities, but never belonged to them. Sedentary empires called nomads dangerous or useful, often both. To nomads, trade and raid were flexible concepts. One day they'd guard your caravan, the next they might sack it. It all depended on mood, season, and payment. Trade was vital. Most nomads couldn't grow crops or forge tools. They needed pottery, cloth, spices, and metal. In return, they offered furs, leather, salt, animals, even falcons. Some traded directly. Others acted as middlemen across the Silk Road. But these weren't harmless caravans. They were armed, fast, and ready. A tribal chief might make deals one week and raid the next. Empires called it betrayal. Nomads called it options. The Scythians traded grain with Greeks, but burned cities if cheated. Bedouins guarded spice routes until someone failed to pay. Even Genghis Khan tried diplomacy first, with the Khwarezm. When their merchants were executed, the Mongols responded by annihilating cities. To nomads, trade wasn't just business, it was personal, political, a reflection of mutual respect. If a sedentary state treated them as equals, commerce thrived. If they disrespected them, retaliation came swift and often on horseback. This tension created border economies. Cities on the edge of nomadic zones became hybrid spaces, half military post, half marketplace. Governors bribed tribal leaders, tribes traded horses, news and intelligence. Sometimes marriages sealed fragile peace. This constant dance between trade and raid wasn't a flaw, it was a feature. It let nomads influence empires without occupying them, shape history without building walls, and stay mobile in a world obsessed with permanence. They didn't need to conquer cities, they just needed cities to keep watching the horizon. But in a world without books or libraries, how did nomads preserve history? Through memory. Oral tradition was their archive. Court, constitution, and soul. From the Scythian plains to the Mongol steppe and Bedouin desert, knowledge was sacred, and the spoken word was sharper than any blade. Elders were living libraries, guardians of lineage, law, and lore. They knew stories that bound the tribe together, proverbs that guided war and diplomacy. These weren't bedtime tales, they were survival tools. Among the Bedouins, poetry was king. A skilled poet could shame an enemy, honor the fallen, or prevent war. Shair, tribal poets, held as much authority as chiefs. Their verses were memorized for generations, shaping identity. The Mongols followed suit. Their great saga, the secret history of the Mongols, was passed down by voice long before it was ever written. It didn't just tell the rise of Genghis Khan, it taught values, loyalty, fate, vengeance, ambition. The Scythians left no books, but Greek writers like Herodotus echoed their stories. Oral history caught mid-air and frozen in text. Oral tradition had flaws, stories changed, memories faded, but it had one unmatched strength. It lived, it adapted, it moved with the people. Long after cities fell and scrolls crumbled, the stories lived on, because someone still spoke them aloud. And as long as someone remembered, nothing was truly lost. In many ancient empires, women were silenced, hidden behind palace walls or veils. But nomadic life told a different story. On the move, everyone worked. Women held power too. From Scythians to Mongols, evidence shows they weren't just mothers. They were riders, warriors, shamans, and diplomats. Survival left no space for passivity. Across the steppes, graves hold women buried with swords and arrows, their bones marked by battle. These weren't symbols. These women fought. Even the Greeks, awed and alarmed, created myths of Amazons, warrior women they believed came from these fierce, mobile tribes. In Mongol society, women managed encampments while men raided and conquered, but even at the highest levels they held power. Genghis Khan's daughters and daughters-in-law ruled territories, led armies, and brokered alliances. One of the most influential women, Sorghaghtani Beki, was a strategist who shaped empires. Among the Bedouins, women had fewer public roles, but wielded influence through poetry, lineage, and hospitality. A woman's tent was her realm. She managed resources, upheld family honor, and raised warriors. In some tribes, women could divorce, own property, even camels, the ultimate wealth. Religion also empowered them. Across Turkic and Siberian steppe cultures, female shamans served as healers and spirit guides, honored as keepers of ancestral knowledge. They weren't fringe, they were central. Mobility bred necessity, and necessity gave rise to a form of equality uncommon in settled empires. Nomadic life demanded flexibility. If a man fell, a woman stepped in. No ritual, no permission needed. She could rock the cradle and draw the bow. Spirituality too reflected their world. With no temples or shrines, faith was tied to land, sky, and journey. Their gods moved with them. Belief systems were animistic, rooted in nature, seasons, and survival. The wind was a messenger, mountains guarded, rivers carried spirits, fire was sacred. Among the Scythians, as described by Herodotus, worship involved sky gods, hearth goddesses, horse sacrifices, and cannabis rituals, all under open skies. No clergy, just warriors and shamans invoking the divine. Pre-Islamic Bedouins honored tribal idols and jinn, spirits of wind, rock, and storm. Poets and seers were seen as inspired or possessed. Hospitality wasn't just custom, it was sacred duty. For the Mongols, faith centered on Tengri, the eternal blue sky. Tengri wasn't a deity locked in a temple, he was the sky itself, watching, judging. Genghis Khan claimed divine right through Tengri. Shamans advised leaders, healed wounds, guided spirits. Yet their beliefs were flexible. Mongols tolerated and even supported Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity, often blending them into their own worldview. A Bedouin might recite Islamic prayers, yet still pour water into the sand for the spirits. Cities tried to contain gods in stone. Nomads carried them across plains. Their rituals flowed like rivers. Their faith needed no walls, just wind, memory, and fire. They left no pyramids or cathedrals. You won't find their capitals on modern maps, but their legacy is written into trade routes, conquest scars, and even modern languages. Nomads weren't historical footnotes, they were architects of upheaval. The Silk Road wasn't built by cities, it was paved by hooves, guarded by riders, and sustained by local wisdom. Without nomads, East and West might never have met. Empires feared them, and they were right to. From hoof-beaten steps to steel-bound rails, one truth repeats. Mobility outlasts stone. Nomads ferried songs, spices, and faith. Mongols rode Chinese printing to Persia. Bedouin honour shaped Islam. Turkic horsemen seeded the Ottomans. Their tracks became Silk Road arteries. Their spirit flickers in modern riding and oral law, proof that wind erases borders. America learned in iron. Lincoln's 1862 Pacific Railway Act unleashed Central Pacific East into the snow-walled Sierra and Union Pacific West across tribal plains, each paid per mile, each gambling with land and lives. Chinese crews dangled in baskets blasting granite. Irish veterans spiked 3 miles a day. Freedmen swung hammers. Native nations bled. Buffalo herds fell, forts rose. Hell on wheels towns bloomed overnight. On May the 10th of 1869 at Promontory Summit, the engines Jupiter and 119 kissed. Telegraph taps spelled done. Bells rang coast to coast. Yet Chinese, Irish and indigenous faces were cropped from the photo. The rails shrank 6-month treks to 7 days, birthed time zones, juiced mines, mills and markets, and crowned tycoons who bought laws even as labourers stayed nameless. Forests fell, rivers bridged, buffalo vanished, sovereign nations were fenced, but a continent was welded into one roaring circuit. History praises the golden spike. The earth remembers the bones beneath. So when you trace progress, look past domes and portraits. Hear steam hiss, grass whisper and hooves echo, reminding us greatness is never just on the postcard, but in the price under the rails. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and listen to the wind. It still carries the names left out of the picture. Imagine for a moment a world without coffee. A world where your morning pick-me-up, the very drink that kickstarts your day, isn't a steaming latte, but a cool, hearty pint of ale. Picture a world where the most crucial business contract you'll ever sign isn't sealed with a pen and a handshake, but with the passing of a shared drinking horn, your word bound by the spirits you consume together. And imagine a world where the wildest, most raucous, drunken party you've ever been to isn't just for a birthday or a holiday. It's a sacred fundraiser for your local church, and your revelry is an act of pious community service. This isn't the latest fantasy epic. This wasn't a land of dragons and elves. This was the historical reality of the Middle Ages, a time stretching for 1,000 years, where alcohol, in all its forms, was so deeply and profoundly woven into the very fabric of life that the act of drinking, and even of getting drunk, could be seen as not just a social necessity, but as something that bordered on a holy ritual. When our minds drift back to medieval times, they are often filled with a familiar set of images: stoic knights in shining armour, towering stone castles piercing the clouds, and the clash of steel in epic history-altering battles. But what about the simple everyday objects? What about the cup in their hands? We tend to view alcohol through our own distinctly modern lens. It's a social lubricant, a carefully marketed luxury, a way to unwind after a long week, or, for some, a dangerous and destructive problem. But for the people of the Middle Ages, from the lowest peasant toiling in the mud to the highest king sitting on a gilded throne, alcohol was something infinitely more profound. It was their medicine when they fell ill. It was a substantial part of their meal when food was scarce. It was the very currency of trust in a world without paper contracts. And in so many ways, it was seen as a direct line to the divine. This wasn't just about escaping a reality that was, by all accounts, incredibly harsh and unforgiving. It was about participating in a complex and unspoken system of social and spiritual rules, where a single cup of wine could define your status for all to see, and a communal swig of ale could bind you to your neighbours with a strength that rivaled blood. Drinking was an inseparable part of nearly every significant moment in a person's life, from the celebration of birth to the mourning of death, and from the public declaration of marriage to the quiet finality of a business deal. So how did this happen? How did a simple fermented beverage get so tangled up with everything from daily survival and nutrition to the most sacred ceremonies of the soul? How did Europe become a continent soaked in beer and wine, where refusing a drink could be a mortal insult, and brewing could be a form of prayer? Today we're uncorking the past to explore the hidden codes, the forgotten meanings, and the surprising truths that governed the world of alcohol in medieval times. We'll separate the persistent myths from the fascinating facts. We'll check in on the devout monks who perfected the art of brewing as a way to glorify God, and we'll find out why, in a world built on faith and fealty, a shared drink was one of the most powerful and essential rituals of all. First things first, let's tackle one of the biggest, most stubborn, and most repeated myths about the Middle Ages: the idea that everyone, from toddlers to grandparents, drank ale and beer all day long for one simple reason: because the water was a toxic, disease-ridden sludge. It's a compelling story, a simple explanation for a complex world, but the historical reality is a great deal more nuanced and frankly far more interesting. Some historians have a name for this trope: the Great Medieval Water Myth, and they call it that for a very good reason. The truth is, the vast majority of medieval people, especially the 90% of the population who lived a rural life out in the countryside, drank water every single day. They weren't fools. They had access to clean springs, fresh streams, and groundwater from wells they had dug themselves. They were perfectly capable of using their eyes, their noses, and their common sense to tell if a water source was clean or foul. If a stream had a tannery or a butcher shop upstream, they knew not to drink from it. There's a wonderful 10th century Saxon text, a colloquy designed to help monks learn Latin, where a young man is asked about his daily life. The master asks, "What do you drink?" His reply is beautifully simple and revealing: "Ale if I have it, or water if I have no ale." It shows a clear preference, to be sure, but it also shows that water was a perfectly normal, acceptable and regular part of his life. So if the water wasn't an automatic death sentence, why was ale the undisputed king of beverages? The answer isn't about avoiding poison, it's about calories, nutrition and practicality. For the vast majority of the population, the peasants, serfs and labourers who performed hours of back-breaking work from sunrise to sunset, Ale was quite literally liquid bread. In a world where famine was a constant threat and the daily diet could be crushingly monotonous and meagre, ale was a vital source of calories and energy. It was brewed from barley, a grain packed with carbohydrates, and the resulting brew was often a thick, nutritious, porridge-like substance. It was an easy and efficient way to consume the thousands of calories they burned working in the fields. Think of it less as a party drink and more as the medieval equivalent of Gatorade or a protein shake. Now, it's crucial to understand that the ale most people drank on a daily basis wasn't the strong, intoxicating stuff we might imagine. It was typically what was known as small beer or small ale. This was a weaker, low-alcohol brew made from the second or even third rinsing of the malted grain. The first, strongest brew was reserved for the wealthy or for special occasions. Small beer was hydrating and caloric, and because it was drunk by everyone, sometimes even children, it was designed to nourish, not to inebriate. It wouldn't get you wasted before noon. The strong ale, the potent stuff, was saved for after the day's work was done, for feast days, or for those who had the coin to afford it. But we shouldn't dismiss the water myth entirely, because it contains a kernel of truth. In the rapidly growing, often chaotic and notoriously filthy cities, the story was different. In a burgeoning metropolis like London or Paris, a single water source like the Thames or the Seine could absolutely become contaminated. With thousands of people living in close quarters and human and animal waste often being tossed directly into the streets and rivers, these urban water sources could become breeding grounds for devastating diseases like typhoid, dysentery, and cholera. In those crowded, unsanitary urban jungles, the brewing process, which crucially involved boiling the water, made ale a genuinely safer, more reliable choice. This is where the legends of figures like St. Arnold of Metz, the patron saint of brewers, find their root. The most famous story about him, likely apocryphal but nonetheless telling, claims that during a deadly plague outbreak, he submerged his own crucifix into a cauldron of beer and urged the panicked locals to drink from it instead of the contaminated water. As the tale goes, his blessed beer miraculously saved countless lives. While that's more of a saintly legend than a documented historical event, it points to a recognized truth of the time. In certain places, at certain times, choosing beer over water really was a life-saving decision. But even with all that nuance, the cultural preference was clear. Given the choice, almost everyone picked ale. It simply tasted better than water. It was more nourishing, and according to the sophisticated medical ideas of the day, it was simply better for you. The brilliant 12th century abbess, mystic, and writer St. Hildegard of Bingen, a respected authority on health, wrote that water is weak and furnishes a person with no strength, while beer, she claimed, fattens the flesh and lends a beautiful colour to the face. In a world where simply staying strong, healthy and alive was a daily battle against scarcity and disease, ale wasn't just a drink, it was a fundamental part of the daily struggle for survival. In the intricate and brittle web of medieval life, trust was a rare gem, delicate, hard-won, and easily shattered. Without a modern legal code, notarized documents, or centralized courts for the average person, a promise could disappear with the morning fog. So how did anyone trust that a deal would be honored? How were oaths made binding? How were friendships forged, alliances cemented, or marriages sealed? Surprisingly, the answer often came not in writing, but in drinking. A shared cup wasn't just a gesture of good faith. It was a social contract, a covenant witnessed by ale and by community eyes. In this world, where few could read and fewer still could enforce a document, ritual and repetition became the law, and alcohol was the ink. The tavern stood at the very centre of medieval life, equal parts town square, newswire, council chamber, and community church. Though the actual church might preach abstinence, even the holiest townsfolk would find themselves seated on worn benches beside smoky hearths, swapping stories and sealing promises. The tavern had its own sacred rites. One entered not simply to drink, but to belong. Inside it was all noise and warmth, tankards clanging, boots thudding on straw-covered floors, voices rising over the din. Beneath the timber beams and walls blackened with soot, people from every corner of society met as equals in the communion of drink. There you could overhear gossip from the next shire, settle a boundary dispute, hire a labourer, or even find a future spouse, all in the time it took to drain a tankard. But more importantly, the tavern was where words became deeds.
If two men made a deal over a pint of ale, the drink itself was the binding force. This wasn't metaphorical, it was legally and culturally accepted. These deals had names: ale lawrings, or wet bargains. The ale was the ritual that converted intention into obligation. Witnesses were often unneeded because everyone nearby became an unofficial record keeper. To renege on such a deal wasn't just dishonourable, it could invite public shame, social punishment, or even violence. Some towns formalise this. If you broke a deal sealed with drink, you might be forced to return to the tavern, apologise publicly, and share another drink, this time as restitution. The drink wasn't just a symbol, it was the mechanism of justice, and this was just the beginning.
Drinking rituals weren't confined to economic deals. They marked every chapter of a person's life. When a young man finished his apprenticeship, a feast was thrown and drink was central, not just for celebration, but to confirm his new status. When families moved into a new town, they were welcomed with communal ale, signalling acceptance into the social fabric. And when someone died, enormous quantities of drink were consumed, not as excess, but as a structured act of mourning. Ale had a spiritual role. Wills from the period often set aside money not for candles or masses, but for ale to be distributed among the poor. This wasn't charity in the modern sense, it was a transactional ritual. The poor received drink, and in return were expected to pray for the soul of the departed. It was salvation paid in pints. Even marriage itself was soaked in drink. The term bridal comes from bride ale, a wedding feast centred around a special strong ale brewed by the bride's family. This wasn't just a celebratory gesture. The sale of the premium ale often helped fund the new household. It was a fundraiser, a community gathering, and a legal ceremony, all at once. The whole village drank, and in doing so, they bore witness to the union. But this could become complicated, especially after a few too many drinks. Enter the infamous tavern betrothals. Court records are full of couples arguing about drunken promises. Did the whispered vow exchanged at the tavern table count as a binding marital contract? In one famous case, a woman had to defend herself in court from a man who claimed they were married, simply because they drank together, and he interpreted it as a vow. Her defence? We drank as friends, not as husband and wife. The court took days to decide. These were not seen as jokes. They were treated with the seriousness of law. And once the baby was born, what better way to bless its life than by raising a drink? This act of drinking together publicly was so central that to refuse a drink was almost unthinkable. It was interpreted as a rejection of not just the drink, but the person offering it. To refuse was to reject friendship, alliance, even hospitality. In a world where identity was tied to reputation, that single act could brand someone as rude, heretical, or dangerous. Some medieval sources even document entire seasonal rituals centred on ale. During harvest festivals, entire villages would brew communal ale and assign one house to host the drinking. At Yule or Midsummer, large wooden bowls were passed around, blessing cups or wassails, used to toast the health of the community. The line between sacred and social, between faith and fermentation, blurred.
And in moments of rebellion, alehouses became meeting grounds. In peasant uprisings or guild protests, many of the plans were whispered over shared drinks. The alehouse wasn't just a mirror of society, it was where society was imagined, reshaped, and sometimes overturned.
It's difficult today to grasp how profoundly this culture shaped everything. Our modern world compartmentalises, business here, religion there, friendship elsewhere. But in the medieval world, these threads were interwoven, and the alehouse was the loom. You prayed, bargained, laughed, argued, wept, and forgave, all over the same cup. So the next time you pass by a pub, or raise a glass at a wedding, remember, you're participating in a ritual older than the nation state, one that once carried legal, spiritual, and emotional weight. In the world of tankards and toasts, promises lived in the cup, and the ale remembered everything. If alcohol was the seal that bound social life, it was even more deeply and intricately tied to the spiritual life of the Middle Ages. The relationship between the Christian church and alcohol was famously complex, a fascinating mixture of divine respect and earthly pragmatism. On the one hand, the church fiercely condemned the sin of drunkenness, seeing it as a vulgar form of gluttony that dulled the senses and pulled the soul away from God. And yet, on the other hand, it steadfastly saw alcohol itself, both wine and beer, as a blessed gift from God, a part of the goodness of his creation. This apparent contradiction created a world where wine could be miraculously transformed into the blood of Christ in the Holy Eucharist, and where devout monks would become the most skilled, most famous and most innovative brewers in all of Europe, treating their craft as a form of liquid prayer. The heart of this sacred brewing tradition was the monastery. Following the rule of Saint Benedict, a 6th century text that governed monastic life, monks were expected to be self-sufficient through their own manual labour. The famous motto was ora et labora, or prayer and work. This rule, combined with another that required them to offer hospitality to travellers and pilgrims, turned monasteries into bustling hubs of agricultural production and craftsmanship. In the colder northern lands of Europe, like Germany, the Low Countries and England, where grapevines couldn't survive, monks turned their considerable energies to brewing beer. What started as a simple necessity, providing drink for themselves and for the weary pilgrims they were obligated to host, soon evolved into a holy art form. Monastic breweries were nothing like the slapdash, inconsistent homebrewing operations of the peasantry. The monks were literate, they were organised, and they approached brewing with scientific rigour and spiritual devotion. They kept meticulous records, constantly experimenting with ingredients and techniques to improve their beer's quality, flavour and consistency. This relentless pursuit of excellence was driven by a powerful theological belief. Since they were working for the glory of God, their product had to be the absolute best it could be. A spoiled or mediocre batch of beer would be an insult to the divine. This sacred drive for perfection led to major, lasting innovations. Most famously the widespread adoption of hops as a flavouring and bittering agent. Before hops, beer was flavoured with a mixture of herbs and spices called gruit. Hops not only added a pleasant bitterness that balanced the sweetness of the malt, but they also acted as a powerful natural preservative, which meant that beer could be stored for longer and, crucially, shipped over long distances without spoiling. This innovation revolutionised the beer trade, and the monks didn't just brew for themselves. Larger abbeys often ran 3 separate brewing operations, one that produced the highest quality, strongest beer, often called a bock or double bock, which was sold to nobles and wealthy merchants to fund the monastery, another that made a simple, wholesome table beer for the monks' own daily use, and a third that brewed a weak, small beer to be given away as charity to the poor and pilgrims. And they certainly did use it. Some monastery records show astonishingly generous daily rations of up to a gallon of ale per monk. This wasn't necessarily about getting hammered. During the long, arduous fasts of Lent or Advent, when solid food was strictly forbidden, beer was famously considered liquid bread and provided essential nutrition and calories without technically breaking the rules of the fast. But the sacred connection to alcohol wasn't just hidden away behind monastery walls. In parishes all across Europe, a wild and wonderfully paradoxical tradition known as the church ale took hold. These events were, for all intents and purposes, massive fundraising parties run by the local church. Villagers would donate their own malt and labour, a special extra strong ale would be brewed, and it was then sold off at a parish-wide festival to raise money for the church's upkeep, for charitable causes or to help the poor of the parish. These events were notoriously rowdy, often lasting for days and involving feasting, dancing, folk plays and games. They were the medieval version of a church bake sale, just with a whole lot more drunken revelry. Of course, the line between pious fundraising and a profane out-of-control party was often dangerously blurry. Church authorities in the higher echelons constantly worried that these events were getting out of hand, leading to sin and disorder. In the 14th century, an exasperated Archbishop of Canterbury condemned the gluttonies and drunkennesses of the common drinking bouts at church ales, and even threatened to excommunicate anyone who took part. But the tradition was simply too popular with the common people, and far too effective at raising essential funds to ever be truly stamped out. It was a perfect medieval marriage of piety and partying, where getting joyfully drunk with your neighbours was a direct and tangible way to support your local church. And at the absolute apex of alcohol's religious importance was, of course, the Eucharist. Wine, miraculously transformed into the blood of Christ during the Mass, was the absolute centre of Christian worship and theology. This sacred role gave wine a theological weight and a spiritual significance that placed it far above all other drinks. The Church itself became a massive patron of vineyards, with powerful monastic orders like the Benedictines and especially the Cistercians meticulously cultivating grapes and perfecting the art of winemaking across Europe. From the raucous joy of the church ale to the solemn mystery of the Eucharist, alcohol was inextricably tied to the sacred. It was a source of monastic wealth and innovation, a tool for community fundraising, and a profound symbol of God's grace. In the medieval world, it served as a social lubricant, not just between people, but between the earthly and the divine. In the rigid, deeply stratified social ladder of the Middle Ages, everything was a signal of your status. The clothes you wore, the food you ate, the language you spoke, and, most definitely, what you drank. While a humble peasant in his draughty hut and a powerful king in his magnificent castle might both be drinking, the liquid filling their cups broadcast everything about their respective places in the world. The fundamental divide was between ale and wine. Ale, in all its forms, was the drink of the common folk. Wine was the drink of power, a potent and unmistakable symbol of wealth, sophistication, and God's favour. For the vast majority of people, ale was the drink of daily life. It was brewed locally, often by the women of the household, the so-called alewives or brewsters, sometimes as a small side business to make a little extra money for the family. It was cheap, it was accessible, and as we've seen, it was nourishing. But for the nobility, the knights and the high clergy, drinking humble ale was almost unthinkable unless they were travelling through the countryside and had absolutely no other choice. To consciously set themselves apart from the lower classes, the elite drank wine. Wine was above all a luxury good. In northern countries like England, Scandinavia and much of Germany, the climate was too cold and damp to reliably grow grapes for winemaking. This meant that wine had to be imported, primarily from the sunnier climes of France, particularly the region of Gascony around Bordeaux. That meant treacherous sea voyages, overland transport costs, hefty taxes imposed by kings and lords, and the constant risk of the product spoiling. All of this combined to make wine incredibly expensive. A nobleman demonstrated his power and influence not just with the size of his castle or the number of soldiers he commanded, but by the quality and sheer quantity of the wine in his cellar. To host a great feast and pour rivers of fine imported French wine for your guests was one of the most ostentatious displays of wealth and status imaginable. The culture surrounding wine was entirely different from that of ale. It was all about performance, refinement, and knowledge. Nobles and wealthy merchants were expected to know their vintages, to be able to discuss the merits of a Gascon red versus a sweeter wine from the Rhine. And yet, ironically, they often drank their wine watered down. This wasn't just to make it last longer, it was seen as a mark of true civilization, a custom inherited from the ancient Greeks and Romans, who believed that drinking undiluted wine was the habit of uncivilized barbarians. They would also frequently add expensive spices like cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and grains of paradise to their wine, creating a potent and aromatic concoction known as hippocras. This served two purposes. It was another way to show off their immense wealth, as spices were astronomically expensive, and it was a useful way to cover up the taste of a wine that was beginning to turn sour. Even the very cup you drank from was a rigid signifier of your status. A peasant would drink his daily ale from a simple rough-hewn wooden mug or a cheap clay pot. A wealthy merchant might use a cup of pewter. A nobleman, however, would sip his spiced wine from a delicate imported Venetian glass goblet, a heavy engraved silver cup, or perhaps a ceremonial drinking horn lavishly decorated with silver mounts. Below the great divide of wine and ale, there was a whole hierarchy of other drinks. Mead or honey wine, the celebrated drink of epic poems like Beowulf, and ciders made from apples or pears were also popular, especially in regions where grain for beer or grapes for wine were hard to come by. They were generally seen as a respectable step up from common ale, but they were nowhere near as prestigious as imported wine. This created a kind of liquid social structure, a class system that you could taste. Your choice of drink was a daily performance of your place in society. A lord drinking wine at his high table wasn't just quenching his thirst. He was performing his status, creating a visible and potent barrier between himself and the ale-drinking masses below. A striking 14th century German religious text illustrates this social anxiety perfectly. In trying to describe the unimaginable horrors of hell, the author imagines that one of the torments of the damned is being forced to drink the dregs, which is the wine of the common people. The ultimate punishment wasn't just fire and brimstone, but being forced to drink below your station for all of eternity. This snobbery was even backed up by the official medical beliefs of the time. Learned doctors whose theories were based on the ancient Greek medicine of the four humours taught that wine was far healthier than beer. Wine was considered hot and dry and was thought to aid digestion and properly balance the body's humours. Beer, on the other hand, was seen as a cold and wet drink, cruder and fit only for the coarse bodies of labourers who needed its fattening qualities. So while alcohol was a powerful unifier in many ways, bringing entire communities together in taverns and churches, it was also a powerful and ever-present divider. The simple choice of what to fill your cup with was a profound statement about who you were, where you came from, and where you stood in the great, unchangeable order of things. The medieval world was a world soaked in alcohol, but as we've seen, its meaning went far deeper than just getting tipsy. It was a fundamental technology of society, shaping everything from daily diet and international trade to sacred faith and social status. So what part of this hidden history surprised you the most? Was it the fact that the bad water story is largely a myth? Was it learning that the word bridal is really all about ale? Or was it the idea that you could get roaring drunk at a church-run party as an act of community service? Let us know in the comments below. We read every one, and if you enjoy uncorking hidden histories like this one, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next journey into the past. The daily ritual of drinking ale was at its core a ritual of survival. It gave millions of people the vital calories, the nutrition, and the safe hydration they needed to live a life of relentless back-breaking labour. It was the fuel that built the cathedrals and cleared the forests. The social ritual of sharing a drink was a ritual of trust. It was the invisible ink on contracts, the glue that sealed alliances, and the force that wove the very fabric of community together in the noisy, warm alehouse. It turned neighbours into a fellowship, and the sacred rituals, from the wild, chaotic fundraising of a church ale to the quiet, patient devotion of a monastic brewer perfecting his craft for God, were rituals of faith. They connected the mundane work of the earth to the worship of the heavens, turning a simple fermented drink into a charitable offering, a form of liquid prayer and a symbol of divine communion. Life back then was fragile and precarious, and every tradition, every substance had to serve a purpose, often multiple purposes at once. Alcohol served many. It was nutrition, it was medicine, it was social glue, it was a status symbol, it lubricated every transaction, from the smallest business deal in a village tavern to the most sacred marriage vow before the church altar. It was so deeply integrated into the daily, seasonal and spiritual rhythms of life that to imagine a medieval world without it is to imagine a world without its essential flavour, its binding agent, and one of its most powerful and profoundly misunderstood rituals. So the next time you raise a glass, whatever is in it, maybe you'll remember a time when that simple act could seal a deal, save a life, or even, in its own strange and wonderful way, serve a god.